I've had this idea in my mind for some time that sending carbon into space can be a catalyst uh, for widespread carbon removal. Um, so, what do I mean by that? Um, I think that the methods of making advanced materials or making like bulk commodities um, from carbon, uh, I think that the space industry can really perfect this process, especially considering that that there will be a lot of situations where if there's a human presence on the space stations or on the moon or on Mars, that we want to create these circular economies and create this like closed loop that the waste from one product would be able to, the waste from one process can feed into another. And we're always recycling the byproducts of each step in the supply chain. And and so what I want to see happen, broadly speaking, for industries on Earth and onto the future, um, I'm excited for the idea that we can take biomass and convert the biomass into biochar, and that the biochar can be a feedstock for some advanced materials like battery grade graphite or industrial diamonds, or um, they also use graphite for electric arc furnaces. The electrodes of electric arc furnaces also use graphite in nuclear facilities. I believe uh, believe the walls surrounding it because it is a good shield against the radiation. Um, so if I mean, maybe you're in space. If you were to have a nuclear reactor, you just put it far away from you. But I have to do a bit more research on how graphite is used in that way. Not that it's important for me to know, but it's just that there are a lot of pretty advanced applications for carbon-based materials. Currently, people mine for graphite, or people make graphite from the byproducts of the fossil fuel industry, coal, coke, and uh, petroleum refining, uh, the byproducts of the petroleum industry and coal industry. And so, man, if we want to get off of fossil fuels, and synthetic graphite has been shown to have a higher performance, then we should look for uh, sources of carbon and graphite that we can make carbon negative, that we're pulling it out of the atmosphere. So so to so in the whole equation, um, it's always going to be a cost analysis that people try to find the most cost-effective way of doing something. And so, I, I think that it's complicated when we start to talk about subsidies or government incentives. Um, but the potential for carbon credits to change that cost equation so that a mined resource or a fossil fuel resource is not as competitive as a carbon negative source. Um, I think that that is a pretty worthwhile application of a subsidy or incentive. I work in the solar industry, and we have renewable energy credits, clean energy credits, and it has been a major factor in accelerating the adoption of renewable energy. Um, so, at the same time, there are huge subsidies for corn and other crops. Um, there are also subsidies for different types of farming methods that um, benefit the water table, or um, there's water management, swales, and other techniques that farmers can apply for grants and subsidies. And it's a way of trying to put a price on the uh, the benefit to the ecosystem and society to have a um, stable sector that good years and bad years, and you don't want farmers to go out of business because of a few bad years. Um, and so, in order to make sure that we have a robust agricultural industry, there are a lot of incentives. Now, there is a lot of controversy that there's a whole lobbying group that will just fight for more subsidies just to benefit themselves, and it becomes pretty debatable at a certain point um, whether it's actually producing a net benefit. Um, so, I mean, it's pretty clear, really, that um, the way that corn and soy and wheat, the way that traditional agriculture is done is very destructive, and that you know the idea that we're losing our topsoil is also debatable. It doesn't seem like it's in good health, but um, from what I've heard, there's some still some debate on the imminent threat of losing the topsoil. But uh, but we want to remove the carbon from the atmosphere, and the process of growing food um, can store carbon in the soil through regenerative methods. And it can also, well, using biomass to make biogas and then to make biochar, it can be removing carbon at each step. And so what we really need is to find a way to make products from the biochar. So I imagine that there would be so many different sectors that could use this. and different grades would have different types of applications because biochar can be used as a soil amendment, and that's kind of historically it's been used as a soil amendment. Um, it works very well when it's mixed with compost and allowed to absorb the nutrients. It has very fine uh, what do you call it? It's a structure. It's what do you say? It's got all the pockets for air. It's very porous, and so mixing it in soil as it is helps with water drainage, and allows water to percolate through the soil better. But when you mix biochar in with compost, it also creates an environment for all the different little microbes and bacteria to colonize those porous um, little air pockets. And they call that charged biochar. Um, on its own, it's just like a mineral almost. It isn't much, it's not really a fertilizer on its own. But when you have charged biochar that has this, uh, compost microbial mix within it, it uh, that is a very potent fertilizer. And you know, s- so what would be most valuable in space? You would think that they'd be growing food all, hydroponically and maybe aquaponics. Um, but I would think that you want to have just layers and layers of redundancy. And so if you were to create a habitat on like the surface of the moon, um, I would think that like let's say they were to dome over an entire crater, um, or starting smaller to create your own smaller domes. Um, I think that just psychologically, it could have a good effect if people could touch like dirt and have soil. If you're growing everything hydroponically and aquaponics and you're just in this completely artificial environment, on the one hand, I think that psychologically it could lead to trouble, um, or just it's hard to predict. But on the other hand, those systems require, almost constant maintenance that aquaponics and hydroponics, if there's an imbalance or if, the pump has an interruption, it could really have a big impact. So, I mean, of course, you want to have layers of redundancy on your power source that's running your lights and pumps and filters and all that kind of stuff. But if you were to create a habitat that literally had soil and perennial plants and created an ecosystem, um, I think that that would be pretty cool. And at the same time, um, it gives you just like some layers of redundancy that if your oxygen filters are not working as well as they could, you have some just natural resources that you've created that are assisting in, cleaning out the CO2 and giving you breathable oxygen. And so all that I just think is cool. But um, but the real potential for, let's say having just robotics and automation to try to take advantage of the resources of the moon and asteroids. Um, I imagine building just massive industrial facilities. Um, and what we want is, steel refining or just metal refining. And they use graphite for the electric arc furnaces. And, making, uh, smelting steel. Believe it's used in the electrolysis process of making aluminum as well. Um, and so these, giant graphite electrodes, as well as the graphite in batteries that I imagine there are spots on the moon that have permanent sunlight, so you could have, constant source of power from solar. But I mean, things require routine maintenance, and there could be a power interruption. Just and you don't want to have an interruption in power in your life support system, so you need to have an uninterruptible. Well, you need to have backup power and energy storage, and so imagine batteries will have a large role to play in space. Um, you got to balance supply and demand, so makes a lot of sense that be constantly producing power from solar and other sources, and demand will fluctuate, and the batteries will help smooth that out. And so, uh, and there's, been some development in graphene. Um, it's possible that a low gravity or zero gravity environment would have benefits in making advanced materials. Graphene has these remarkable electrical properties. Um, it may just come to pass that there are different types of electronics that are possible from it's possible to make using materials like graphene, or maybe there's other advanced materials of the taking advantage of the strength of the material. And so, we could have manufacturing facilities in space. And, most all resources for sure we're going to want to source from space. Absolutely. Um, but if we design a system of incentives and subsidies around materials that are carbon negative, and we want to build infrastructure in space, um, and we're lowering the cost of bringing mass to orbit, um, you know, if we want to further lower the cost of sending mass to orbit, then we could, you know, maybe being paid to remove it could help offset that cost more. Um, and so if you want to, if you want to build facilities, then there's a lot of stuff you got to bring with you. Um, if we want to build mining and refining capabilities in space, um, we want to we want to build the infrastructure to take advantage of the resources of space, then I would think that the easier we make it for ourselves, the better. So if we can create these advanced materials on Earth and already have the components needed to build a steel refining or advanced batteries, if we want to send those up just ready to go, and then all we have to do is take the time to collect the material to then further process um, resources found in space. We want to have our energy resources, the refining and manufacturing resources um, already ready to go. Um, if we're just going to find absolutely everything that we're going to use from space, I think that it's going to take a lot of time, and we're going to end up building a lot of infrastructure that in itself is just very costly and time consuming. Um, and you know, I think the benefit to Earth in trying to advance this industry that is removing carbon from the atmosphere, um, I think that I think we should encourage every single avenue that does this. And I think the benefits of getting the greatest minds in the world, of best engineers and scientists to solve the challenges that it takes to build infrastructure in space, and put that parameter on them, uh, to encourage people to take the carbon from the atmosphere, put it in advanced materials, and then send it to space. Um, is that going to actually reduce global warming? Um, Not likely, actually. It is going to take hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 each year to be removed. That's what we need to do. Um, but in order to get there, we have to build up these industries. And so I think that um, people building products now on Earth, there's other sources already available, and people are just following the cost metrics that exist. But yeah, I mean, wow, just imagine, like, um, just imagine that you design a system that can take biological material and oh, I'm losing it. Oh man. So just imagine, SpaceX uses methane rocket fuel, and their goal, what they say, is to uh, use the Sabatier process on Mars to make rocket fuel. So it seems pretty clear that they should develop what they need to do that on Earth, and to use the Sabatier process to make their rocket fuel now, and then really perfect that equipment, uh, apply their expertise in manufacturing to make that as good as possible and continue to improve it and achieve those economies of scale, so that they're not sending off this boutique one-off piece of equipment to Mars that, you know, maybe isn't really that good because it was just like this super, super custom project that they would have been better off if they had been refining the whole process and gone through those, multiple layers of iteration and seen over time how it wears and what the weak link is and so they should be testing it now, making their rocket fuel. So I mean, I kind of imagine that you know I've been following spin launch, and I've been interested in the idea of mass drivers. I know the Starship is a huge vehicle, and it might seem just like absurd, but it's just like one of those crazy ideas that maybe someday you'd have massive mass drivers to eliminate the first stage of a rocket, so they're not actually burning their rocket fuel on the surface as much, at least. But if you had a carbon neutral rocket fuel and you sent it into space, you took it out of the air, then you burnt it, you put it back in the air. Um, so it's just neutral. But if you're taking rocket fuel into space and then refueling your rockets to go, further to the moon and to Mars, then that is carbon negative. Um, it's not really carbon negative if the source of the methane is natural gas, because that natural gas could have stayed in the ground. Um, you know, it's possible to use hydrogen oxygen rockets. I mean, that's what NASA and many companies are using, hydrogen oxygen. But Elon's made a pretty good case for methane oxygen or methalox, and so I mean, it's kind of remains to be seen what the future will hold for that whole concept of refueling in space. There may be other forms of propulsion that uh, come to dominate the space. That there's even been some progress with nuclear fusion, rocket propulsion, and getting to Mars in a couple weeks would be amazing. I mean, amazing. But yeah, it seems that I mean, obviously, people think about the costs of everything, and that's what it comes down to. Is there's only so many resources, there's only so much money to go around, and if we want to have the greatest impact, we should dedicate our resources to having the biggest impact or to getting the most bang for our buck. Um, so I think that having these sort of broad approaches to creating a system that applies to space that then could also apply to um, systems on Earth. I think that's a good approach. Um, so, um, I'm very interested in the idea of biogas, anaerobic digesters or gasification. That's one way of creating biogas, converting, you know, crops. There's ideas of using like switchgrass, or I think it'd be cool to just have prairies and graze animals and then, periodically you could harvest just any biomass. It could even be, you know, sewage or um, lawn clippings or, um, yeah, I mean, we should have collection sites all just the same as we have landfills and garbage and recycling pickup. There are places that do this that, um, if I know lots of landscapers and tree trimmers struggle in finding a good place to dispose of wood chips and uh, debris. So, we should really design these systems to, collect all this biomass and then convert that into a form of, um, you know, the it can have biogas, but also all these solid waste byproducts that are you can value add into biochar and or compost, you know. So all that is pretty amazing. But the idea that you could make rocket fuel directly pulling it from the CO2 from the air, um, that could be like, a really pure source of methane. And and you don't even need it to be that pure. Um, Gosh, it almost like hurts to say this because of my like entire life I've been passionate about, clean energy, but I'm starting to see how if we really perfect carbon neutral fuels, and people also call it e-fuels, kind of like Sabatier process type electrochemical approach, and we really perfect these carbon neutral fuels while also perfecting carbon capture, then that is an amazing form of long-term energy storage. Right now, natural gas is kind of taking the place to that batteries will eventually take of um, balancing supply and demand and ramping up and down as the supply fluctuates. Um, so if we were able to take the huge excess of wind and solar that now there's something called curtailment when they produce more than what the grid can accept. It would create surges on the grid or damage equipment. So uh, they'll just turn off wind or solar when there's an agreement with the utility and a um, project developer. It's called curtailment when they just waste the power. So if we could, as we get closer and closer to 100% wind and solar, there's going to be a lot more times where we're producing not just 100% of the energy needs, but it could even be like 200% of the energy we need. We're actually just making so much more than we possibly could use. And so making liquid fuels could be a great flexible load that, could really run full throttle when there's a huge excess of supply. And then, when there's not as good conditions for wind and solar, then it could be the first load to drop if it's just being flexible. So then you put carbon capture on all that, and you would be removing a lot of you'd be removing a lot of CO2 that way. And you might think like, why not just use direct air capture? But the problem with direct air capture is that it's kind of just all cost. Um, you are removing CO2 from the environment, and it requires, a certain amount of, CapEx of capital uh, equipment that you're building, and there's a lot of cost to that. And then there's the energy cost, the operating cost, and then what are you really producing? You're just getting a concentrated source of CO2, and they're pumping it underground mostly, or maybe using it as a feedstock for another industry. Um, but you know, from what I've seen, that there is an enormous capacity of underground reservoirs to pump CO2, that it's a safe thing. I just think that we should really reduce uh, the amount of just like total cost. Um, so, yeah, I mean, at the same time that we could use these liquid fuels as a form of energy storage and then also make them carbon negative. Um, we can also replace all the other materials that we use petrochemicals to make, plastics and polymers, and um, we can create these molecular forms of value and then continue to value add them and yeah, the use the grid, um, you know, be a service to the grid as a flexible load. All these electrochemical processes can be managed by like an AI energy management system that is going to predict the needs of the grid. It's going to predict supply, demand, and it'll know, what is most valuable. Is it good to just, run the compressors and just like, you know, take the, you know, just take the volume that we've produced and now we're just going to compress it and liquefy it. Uh, that might be the best way to spend the energy. Or maybe now we have, such and such stock of liquefied hydrogen and of CO2, and now it's time to create methane from that driving electrochemical process. Maybe it's more valuable to be producing green ammonia from that, or maybe it's more valuable to be um, then further value adding the ammonia or the methane to make plastics. Um, and I mean, and I would think that probably it makes the most sense to run those things like essentially all the time. And it's just when the grid gets stressed that in those worst case scenarios, those will be the first loads to drop. And so, um, and that's how we're going to avoid being in these situations where you have like brownouts and blackouts because we're kind of always just trying to create a reserve of these forms of value. And yeah, so but it's all very complex process, and it's all like it's thinking in terms of elements, um, of building value from the bottom up versus like going out into the environment and finding something of value and then refining it and like breaking it down. And I think that that is so powerful and is what would lead to just limitless resources and abundance. Because, clearly hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and carbon is also very abundant. And if we really master the process of taking building blocks of materials and then value adding these building blocks, then we can never will never run out of those things. It's almost like electricity. Like it takes energy to, you know, uh, to produce electricity. Let me try to say this. There's electrons in everything. We're never going to run out of electrons. Um, and there's always a source of energy. The sun is constantly bombarding us with energy and driving the process, making wind, and so I mean all the learning how to take advantage of the ever-present energy and convert that fundamental building block of an electron and converting that energy into a molecular form of value that then we're going to extract hydrogen from the environment and value add in that way, and then just continuously build up in the chain to produce more and more forms of value. um, and in the process we should design the system to be removing CO2, to be rewarding the permanence of removing CO2. And so that's a really key word, the permanence, because you know, I think that there's some debate. Like if you pump CO2 underground, could it ever leak and come back up through the well? If it was ever damaged or this or that, is it pressurized? Like, and there's a well. I'm not I'm not a geologist, so I mean, I don't know if there's there's um there's underground reservoirs that I know that there's like salt aquifers underground, and that's a good deposit area for pumping CO2. But it's hard to say what the long, long, long-term impacts are. Thinking 20 years, 30, 40, 100 years. Um, it's difficult to say. Um, but what happens now is carbon credits are often rewarded for protecting a natural space. Like you're going to prevent a part of the rainforest from being cut down. And theoretically, um, the rainforest is a carbon sink and it's continuously absorbing carbon from the environment. I think that there's a lot of research that needs to be done to sort of demonstrate that. Because, I mean, kind of to my mind, we should protect the rainforest because it's just intrinsically valuable, and we should defend biodiversity and protect natural spaces just because it's the right thing to do. But I'm not in, I'm not positive that it's actually carbon negative. And what's really a crime is that a lot of carbon credits have been given out for protecting a wild space, and then after that person gets that money, maybe it's illegally logged against their wishes, or they sell the land and they do it themselves. So if you're gonna store carbon somewhere and get paid for it, but then that carbon's just released, that decade, it really didn't do any good at all. And that is just a complete waste. Um, and so, even if it's like planting trees, where definitely you're storing carbon, planting a tree, especially mangroves and, different plants and animal communities have uh, different rates of carbon removal. But all the nature-based solutions have seen a lot of criticism that they're not really permanent because the wildfire or change in the climate could change how that carbon is stored and it would just be released again. So I think that we definitely should still create incentives for nature-based solutions, but I think that we should give a higher reward for permanence. That if, I'm a big fan of biochar, and if you're gonna pump CO2 underground, it's just all cost. There's really no purpose to it. That the only purpose is to get it out of the air. Um, then it could even be debatable how permanent it is if it ever leaked and was released again. Um, compare that to something like biochar. Even if we don't have all of the answers on how to take advantage of biochar fully, that this potential to make uh, advanced materials and to value add it. Um, you can just stockpile it and it can sit there and just that is almost more valuable than just pumping CO2 underground. Um, but at the same time, it is just all cost, and it's probably much more costly to produce it and stockpile it. Um, but different forms of permanence or different projections of permanence, I think should see higher rewards, and that's kind of the way the industry's headed. And what could be more permanent than sending it into space? So if you saw much higher rewards for that, and that created an incentive for people to design machines that would then value add biochar, convert gases into other forms of, advanced materials, creating graphene. And, I don't have all the answers to this, but I really think that sending carbon into space, it just sounds badass to me. And it's like then the next level is it's really creating this incentive structure to then build this infrastructure into space. And then the other side of the equation of, we have to mine for all the resources to make all the batteries and the solar panels and everything else requires a lot of rare earth minerals, but building infrastructure into space and being able to, just bring one asteroid back and you've now got 10,000 times the amount of this resource that it took to destroy, how many million acres or whatever. I'm just kind of throwing random numbers out there, but just uh, if we accelerate the timeline of building uh, the ability to take advantage of the resources of space, we accelerate that timeline. I mean, that means that we will be sourcing materials that are not destroying the environment much sooner. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, the impact is really twofold or more. So, yeah, might seem pretty far out, but send the carbon to the moon. That's what I say.